Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're talking about whether or not you can sue someone if they give you COVID. If you've taken all kinds of precautions to prevent yourself from getting sick, and someone still transmits COVID to you, either at work or in a public, can you sue them? What about criminal consequences for spreading COVID? As Canada opens back up and we learn about the possibility of breakthrough infections in vaccinated people, this question is on some people's minds. What would be required to create civil or criminal liability for transmitting a contagious virus? There is some case law on this issue which arose out of AIDS transmission. Can those cases be applied in the COVID context? There are also laws that limit liability for transmitting COVID, but not in every situation. Here today to discuss the question is employment lawyer Howard Levitt and University of Ottawa law professor Stephane Serafin. Thank you both for joining me today. Mr. Levitt, I'd like to start with you. You recently commented on this issue in the Financial Post. Can you tell me what would it take to make someone liable for spreading COVID either in the workplace or in public?
Really, it's a matter of negligence law. If someone knows they might have symptoms or they have symptoms, they know they might have COVID as a result of that, and they carelessly tell no one, especially if they breach company policies in terms of reporting their sickness and leaving for home, and someone gets COVID as a result of that, whether it be the person they actually have contact with or someone who they in turn transmit the disease to, they could be sued successfully in negligence. And let's assume the person has a fatal injury or is sick for many, many years to come, which of course are consequences of COVID. The damages could be in hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. And that's for one person, let alone several people who might end up, if they're a super spreader.
Professor Serafin, what are your thoughts on what it would take to make someone liable for spreading COVID?
Well, I agree. It is mostly a matter of negligence law. I mean, setting aside instances where people might intentionally spread contagious disease, which I don't think are going to be that common, not to say it can't happen, but it's going to be about negligence liability. And I think the biggest issue here, the biggest question mark I have is the question of, well, when you're establishing negligence liability, the first question you ask is always, is there a duty of care and to whom? And to me, this is the biggest question here. In the employment context, it's likely to be easier to establish than, say, vis-a-vis a stranger on the street. But really, that's the primary question. And then there's, of course, issues that arise afterwards about causation, the extent of the injury, the extent of the damage, and how much you can actually claim for it. But yeah, it's really about negligence liability primarily.
So, Mr. Levitt, how extreme would a case need to be? I mean, what is the difference here when we talk about negligence, gross negligence, or even doing something intentionally? Those are all different things. What is the difference?
I think the distinction between negligence and gross negligence in this context is a difference without substance. It's really the same thing for all practical purposes. If someone is careless, just to use the common vernacular, careless, and know they may have the disease, and they have some symptoms of the disease, and they wantonly continue to not inform anyone, interact with other people, not take precautions to protect the other people who they have a duty to protect, which is everyone around them, frankly, then they can be sued. And of course, there's genetic and other testing. You can prove where it actually emanates from. If you were to sue someone, they can't say it wasn't me, you can't prove it. You can prove it, actually, these days, because medical science makes it pretty easy to know who the disease transmitted from. So that's negligence. Intention has other aspects because, of course, if you intentionally spread it because, well, people are funny. People have all kinds of abnormal characteristics in different contexts, and some people just are that malicious. They might intentionally spread it. You can't count that out entirely, although obviously it'll be the exception. And proving intention, of course, might be very difficult unless there's an acrimonious relationship between the persons in question. Then the court's not only going to give the same measure of damages, but there'll be substantial punitive damages as well.
Professor Serafin, do you think someone would need to actually know that they're positive in order to qualify for negligence, or would just being unvaccinated be enough to create liability?
That's a very interesting question. And to be honest, the answer in the abstract, I don't know that we have any case law on this. This is a very novel situation. The question is going to ultimately fall to whether, what counts as a reasonable action, what a reasonable person would do in that scenario, which, is a very flexible standard. It's been criticized on that basis. Some people think it's completely, not useful because it doesn't allow you to predict what the courts are actually going to do when they're seized with a dispute.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice. Stephane, I wanted to let you finish what you were saying there. I'd asked you about liability. If you'd actually, for spreading COVID, if someone could sue you, would it be enough just to know that you're unvaccinated? Would that be enough to create liability here?
Like I was saying, it's a very interesting question, and it's going to have to ultimately be decided on the basis of what we consider a reasonable person to have done in the circumstances. And, people have different views about that right now, the view about whether we should get vaccinated, whether it should be mandatory. So, yeah, it's a very difficult question from my perspective.
Now, Mr. Levitt, people have different views. I know that you're one of them. What's your view?
Look, as of today, as of the moment we're taping this discussion, it would not be enough to simply be unvaccinated if you don't have any symptoms. You have no reason to believe you have COVID or you're a spreader. But here's the point. The law changes based on public policy. And increasingly, we've seen federal government mandating vaccinations in the workplace, City of Toronto mandating vaccinations, all the banks mandating vaccinations. Seneca College was the forerunner. Loyalist College and other colleges are saying it now. Everybody's jumping on board. A lot of my clients haven't had so many calls about anything as I've had in the last week from different employers in this country and in this province in particular, but not just this province. And as it becomes de rigueur to require workplace vaccinations, I could see the law evolving very easily to if an employee gets, or a customer or a supplier, anyone, contracts COVID in a workplace, with everybody, chief medical officers, levels of government officials, either requiring or suggesting and proposing vaccinations, it might reach the point that a judge will say, since this company did not require vaccinations, you're negligent in not doing that. Because vaccination is the gold medal standard of protection of the workplace. So I could see the law evolving that anybody who gets COVID in a workplace where there is not a requirement of mandatory vaccinations, that's prima facie negligent and they'd have a good case. Not today, but maybe 3 weeks or 4 weeks from now even.
I mean, this is a new thing. Employers mandating vaccinations, either for their staff or customers, and others are not. And I think universities are one of the biggest examples right now, although the new announcement today of a lot of banks have suddenly mandated it. Stephane, or Professor Serafin, what do you think the implication of this policy being so widespread in some institutions means for creating liability? If vaccination isn't made mandatory, are they at risk of having liability if there's an outbreak? But on the other hand, are they at risk of liability if some of their employees or students challenge these vaccine mandates? How do they balance those two interests?
Right. I mean, I'll have to be honest. My employer was one of the first to mandate vaccines, and I'm frankly not entirely comfortable with the way that was done. And so you're right. There is a balancing act to be made here, and the biggest question for me, I guess, is this. On the one hand, I think that my co-panelist is completely right. To the extent that people and organizations all adopt this policy, it is more and more likely that courts will actually go in the direction of saying that, vaccination is what a reasonable person should be doing in the circumstances. There's another question, which is, should the courts actually be going down that route? And as you mentioned, there's also the risk that certain people will challenge the mandatory vaccine policies. And on that level, I think it's less likely that it'll be challenged, say, in civil remedies, and so for monetary damages, for example. And you'd see more along the lines of just challenging workplace policies, challenging any kind of sanctions that employers try to impose on employees as a consequence of not getting vaccinated. So the issues, I guess, in a sense, they're contradictory sort of problems, but in a sense, they're also separate problems in a strange way.
Mr. Levitt, I think we only have about 30 seconds. I'm going to pose this question to you. You can answer it in the next segment. But some workplaces are different from others. For example, it might be more consequential for an employee to hide a positive COVID case if they work in a long-term care facility where they're vulnerable people, as opposed to if a bank employee who's mostly work from home right now hides a positive COVID case or spreads it only in a small group of mostly not particularly vulnerable people, presumably. When we come back, I want your opinion on the difference between those types of workplaces and the different risks of liability faced by those workplaces. Welcome back to Canadian Justice. Mr. Levitt, I want to follow up with you on my last question. Is it different if an employee spreads COVID at, for example, long-term care facility or hospital versus an employment place like a bank where there's fewer vulnerable people? Does spreading it in one context versus another create different liabilities?
I want to make a separate point related in the first instance. If someone lies about their vaccination status and it's being asked of them, it's cause for discharge. So let's be clear on that. Don't lie. You have a better case if you tell the truth and refuse to do it than if you actually lie about it. Because then you have to compound the initial offense with the defense of dishonesty, which is a serious employment law cause defense for employers. Now, to answer your actual question, although I couldn't stop jumping into that territory a little bit because it relates to it, there's no question if in a long-term care home or hospital, that the standard of care is different. You've got to be more protective. So to the extent Professor Serafin and I are debating whether or not it's negligent per se, if you have some symptoms, someone catches you, and you go into work, there's no question of that in a situation like that as opposed to, say, a bank. But at the end of the day, if negligence is found, although it's more likely people are going to die in a long-term care facility, and this will sound callous and terrible, but I'm just being a lawyer, which is sometimes callous and terrible. I'm going to say that if someone is 85 and dies, the damages is going to be much less than if somebody's 35, making 1.5 million a year as an investment banker and have 50 years of that ahead of them. So the negligence damages are going to be much, much greater. It's a future income loss, for example, and life expectancy issues. So I think I've covered the gamut of the question at this point.
Mr. Serafin, one of the things that's interesting to me about this is that there is legislation that actually limits liability for certain organizations, and I believe that long-term care home facilities are one of them. If there's liability protection against outbreaks, does this create sort of a moral hazard? Are people less likely to take precautions or impose policies like mandatory vaccination if they don't have this risk of liability?
That's a very good question. I mean, I'll actually jump in and say that one of the other issues involved in all of this is, okay, hypothetically in a workplace setting, I can sue my employer, I can sue my coworkers potentially even, but there's also workplace safety and workplace insurance law that comes in, and in some sectors will also limit the types of claims you can bring. So these are all sort of tied into the question of, no fault liability schemes. Does that let people off the hook? It's an interesting question. And we can assume that one of the reasons why certain sectors were exempted is because we wanted them to not bear these costs. Now, whether that, there's probably social policy reasons for that, whether that creates negative consequences as well, it's likely, but I don't know what those are, to be completely honest. And I haven't done the empirical work really to know what those are.
Mr. Levitt, your views on this liability limiting legislation that some governments have passed for certain organizations, and if you think it's a good thing?
No, I generally don't think liability limitations are a good thing, period, full stop, because for exactly the reason you alluded to, if you're protected from liability, you're going to put resources into different things. You don't have to worry about spending money on that. So it disincents organizations to do the right thing and be protective of their members.
Just turning briefly back to Professor Serafin, is spreading COVID at work any different from spreading other illnesses? And does the answer change if we're comparing unionized or non-unionized workplaces?
Well, this is an interesting question because, so in a certain sense, you could compare it to AIDS, right, or HIV, as you mentioned at the outset. But the easier comparator would be something like influenza. And I am not aware of any cases where anyone has successfully claimed a negligence against another person for spreading influenza at the workplace. There may be some cases, but I'm not aware of any such cases, in part because, as we've all been assuming throughout, the consequences of COVID and the pandemic itself, we've been locked down for a reason, right? The consequences of COVID are much greater than influenza. So just by that fact alone, there is a difference. The amount of monetary damages you can claim when somebody gets actually sick and suffers long-term repercussions is significantly higher than someone who is debilitated for a week or two.
But in some contexts, I mean, the flu can kill some people, especially if they're vulnerable people in long-term care facilities. When we come back from this commercial break, I'm going to ask that question to you, Mr. Levitt. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about COVID and liability. Mr. Levitt, I wanted to give you the chance to answer the question from the last segment of how is spreading COVID at work different from spreading any other contagious illness at work, for example, the flu?
Well, Professor Serafin's comment was actually quite interesting. I've always viewed it as the AIDS analogy rather than the flu analogy, although the flu analogy may be more comparable. The point is this: COVID is dramatically more dangerous, virulent, and contagious than the common flu. So whether it quite applies may not be the case. There's been a number of cases for arbitrators about compulsory flu vaccines from a few years back, and people who oppose vaccines often throw them up as comparators, and they're not comparators at all, because first of all, the basis of the decision was primarily that the flu vaccine at the time, 7 or 8 years ago, was only about 50% reliable, as opposed to 95+% reliable. And then there's the issue of how dangerous it is if you get it. So that doesn't really apply. I would think the AIDS analogy cases is a good one, only because I don't know of any flu cases, although one would think one could make the same argument with respect to the flu. If one intentionally spreads it, as in the AIDS cases, it's both criminal and it's, of course, it's a tort. In other words, something you can sue for legally. If you negligently spread influenza or AIDS, I guess by having unprotected sex in the latter case, and by having obvious symptoms, being aware you have it, having diagnosed, and then going near people, and they're catching a turn, there's no reason why you wouldn't be held negligent and be able to be sued for that as well. Although again, most people react mildly to the flu, and therefore the damage wouldn't be worth the price of the lawsuit.
Yeah, I think your point about the criminalization for spreading AIDS in some situations, which it has been, is a really valid one. Do you think there's any potential for criminal liability for spreading COVID, Mr. Levitt?
Well, I know that there is actually, from talking to senior members of the police department, and Section 220 and 222, because I'm not a criminal lawyer, the criminal code in criminal negligence causing bodily harm or causing death apply directly if you have it, you know you have it, and you deliberately spread it.
Right.
Of course, it's a crime of intention, unlike negligence.
Absolutely. Now, Professor Serafin, I want to talk to you briefly about reasonable foreseeability and negligence. Canada has high vaccination rates, and breakthrough COVID seems to be relatively rare, at least so far. It also is the vaccine is also quite effective at preventing serious illness. How do these facts impact liability or reasonable foreseeability for spreading the virus for someone who is unvaccinated and might unknowingly be spreading COVID?
Well, I mean, it impacts on two different levels, right? So on the level of your standard duty, do you have a duty to other people? If everyone else is vaccinated and we're in a scenario, which may not be the one we're in right now, where vaccines are, fully protecting you from all the major consequences of what's going on, then the question of whether you have a duty to other people becomes a little bit more easy to avoid, if you will. The duty becomes easier to avoid. And then there's also the question of what kinds of injuries can you claim? What kind of compensation can I get on the other end? Are these injuries, the damages I've suffered, reasonably foreseeable given the type of conduct that I engaged in. And if everybody else is vaccinated, then perhaps it's not. And again, this is a question that comes back to how efficient, how effective are vaccines really?
And they are proving to be quite effective at preventing serious illness. Mr. Levitt, Professor Serafin, that's all the time that we have. I want to thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today to talk about this topic. It's going to be with us for a while, and I really appreciate you both sharing your expertise today.
Christine, thanks so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
We've heard today about liability for spreading COVID. Should this once-in-a-century virus mean we change how we deal with illness and liability? Or are these rules in place because they make sense? Is punishing people for spreading sickness, even unintentionally, an unethical and dangerous mentality? COVID is new, but contagion is not. We've dealt with dangerous, contagious illnesses in the past, and in my opinion, stigmatizing the sick is a dangerous path. But if someone is intentionally and knowingly causing harm, they should face consequences. But what do you think? How does civil or criminal liability apply for making someone sick? How does the risk of liability interact with mandatory vaccination policies? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.